Okay, so we're going to close out by talking about perceived organizational support and engagement in an organization, as well as I think a couple of other minor points. But this is the last video for this module. So, um, in your book, perceived organizational support is briefly described as a mediator between commitment and certain outcomes. And that's true, but I think it deserves a little bit more of an examination than what the book gives. So let's go ahead and go into it. So perceived organizational support refers to when an employee perceives that the organization values their contribution. So this is a little bit different than what we saw with commitment. Commitment is more about the employee's affective bond and their bond to the organization. This is more about how the employee perceives the organization supports them. So, your organization, you feel like your organization values you. You feel like they care about your well-being and they take your goals and values into account. So why does perceived organizational support develop? Well, it develops when an employee believes that the positive treatment that they get from an organization is because of positive regard, that the organization actually values them as a person. It's not just because they want to increase their bottom line. They believe that they are truly and sincerely valued and supported by their organization. So the things that predict perceived organizational support include what we've already talked about, things like fairness. So the more fairly treated that you are, or the more fairly you are treated, the more likely you are to believe your organization supports you. Leadership will actually talk about in a couple of modules. I won't dwell on that. If you have an abusive supervisor, the less likely you are to perceive that your organization supports you. If your supervisor breaches your psychological contract, so these implicit deals or agreements that we have with people, for example, I think in the last module I talked about how someone, or even explicit, someone had it's implicit. If you have a deal with someone, a psychological deal, a mutual understanding, something that you both have basically implicitly agreed upon, but your supervisor breaks that, or a coworker breaks that, then that leads to lower perceived organizational support. If there are more developmental opportunities in your organization, you perceive that there is also more organizational support. It actually, like we mentioned, this can operate as a mediator. It can impact commitment, particularly affective and normative. It can lead to greater trust in multiple parties in the organization, including your coworkers, your management, your supervisor, and the organization itself. It can lead to more OCBs and less turnover. So the more you perceive that your organization supports you, the less likely you are to quit. Your book also mentions engagement. I am going to talk about that also a little bit more in more detail than the book did. So engagement refers to an energetic state in which employees are both dedicated to excellent performance and they are confident in their effectiveness. So there are three dimensions. I think your book also mentions these. Your book mentions these dimensions here. Another set of terms for those are right here as well. So energy, involvement, and efficacy. Engagement is the opposite of burnout. I think your book also tries to pose it as the opposite of workaholism, but it's a little bit different. So burnout is the erosion of your engagement. It's when you just feel exhausted, when you can't muster the energy to do your work. It's when you feel cynical about the work and inefficacious. You feel like you can't do anything. So that's burnout. Engagement is the opposite of that. It's when you feel energetic. It's when you feel engaged in your work. You're thriving and you're happy. So here's some of the ways, like I said, there are different dimensions. We can talk about it in terms of energy, involvement, and efficacy, or dedication, vigor, and absorption. So dedication is the aspect of engagement that gets at your feeling of dedication about your work. It includes when we're measuring it, we can measure it using items like I'm enthusiastic about my job and my job inspires me. For vigor, the other dimension of engagement, we can measure it using things like when I get up in the morning, I feel like going to work, or at my work, I feel bursting with energy. I once gave this measure to some workers, and when they got to this item right here, a bunch of them laughed because they thought it was so ridiculous, the idea of being bursting with energy at work. And then absorption. So this is the last aspect of engagement. This gets at this feeling of being really absorbed in your work. So we could ask people to rate their agreement with time flies when I'm working and I feel happy when I'm working intensely. So that's what engagement is. There are other related constructs to work engagement or job engagement. Job involvement is somewhat related to your work engagement. This is your cognitive, so your mental engagement in the job. This obviously also involves some emotional factors to it. This, though, is a little bit more of your thoughts and beliefs about your engagement with the job. Work centrality is also a related construct. This gets to the importance of work in your life. And then we have workaholism. Workaholism, your book poses it, as I said, as burnout, but I would actually characterize it more as an unhealthy commitment to your work. So it's almost like a very extreme form of job commitment, because often workaholism is not necessarily driven by organizational commitment, and it's far more complicated than I think what the textbook gets into. Now, I don't have a slide here about this, but for the record, we know that we know that work engagement, that it positively impacts a lot of outcomes, and it's also sometimes seen as a desirable outcome. So we may actually look at engagement as an outcome because we want our employees to be engaged, because as you can tell, people who possess these feelings and these thoughts, they're far more likely to perform their jobs well. So your textbook talks about emotions a little bit in this module or in this chapter. I just want to clarify that we will talk about emotions later when we talk about stress and well-being. I feel like it's more important and more relevant to talk about emotions in the workplace when we're talking about stress, as opposed to when we are talking about work attitudes. So that's it. This one was a little bit shorter than all of the others, but those are all the attitudes that we would be interested in studying in the workplace.